When I saw my husband staring at the folded piece of paper on the kitchen table, I felt something inside me collapse. Not from guilt, that had settled in me weeks ago like sediment at the bottom of a glass. No. It was the way he held the note, delicately, like it might dissolve in his fingers. He hadn't said a word yet. His eyes just moved slowly across the page, line by line, while I stood motionless in the doorway. I knew exactly which note it was. I knew the handwriting. And the words. Especially that last line, the one I had written with trembling fingers, thinking no one would ever read it. You are my only truth. He looked up. Not at me, through me. As if trying to see where I ended and the lie began. I wanted to speak, to explain, but what could I say? That it started with something as innocent as a folded corner in a book left outside? That all I wanted was to feel seen again? My throat tightened. He didn't move. Just held the paper, held my fate, and I realized this was the moment I had dreaded every single day since it all began. The garden. The notes. The boy. My husband's mouth opened slightly, like he was about to ask something, but he didn't. Instead, he slid the paper across the table toward me. That small motion, it broke me. And yet, that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was knowing he didn't even need an answer. Not anymore. But before I tell you how everything unraveled, how one summer evening changed the course of my life, leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. And answer me this: have you ever written something, a letter, a message, a confession, that you prayed no one would ever find? The first time I stepped into that house, I wanted to believe it could be a beginning. Not a continuation of something broken. A beginning. The floors smelled of polish, the windows were too clean, and the silence, it felt heavy, not peaceful. I told myself it was just unfamiliarity. That I would grow into the walls like ivy. That I'd belong. My husband had bought the house before we married. It was his symbol of new life, of stability. I arrived with my suitcase and my good intentions, trying not to let the echo of past failures follow me through the front door. He greeted me with a kiss on the cheek and a quick mention that his son would be arriving in a few hours. You'll like him, he said. He's quiet, keeps to himself. I nodded and smiled, though I didn't know what I was expected to do with that information. I hadn't come to be anyone's stepmother. I had come to be a wife. By evening, the boy had arrived. 18. That liminal age when one hovers between manhood and the soft remains of childhood. He barely spoke at dinner. Just answered politely and looked at his plate. I watched him when I thought he wouldn't notice. There was something unreadable in his expression, like he'd already built a wall inside himself. My husband talked about property taxes and renovations. I stirred my salad, nodding when necessary. That night, when we went to bed, I noticed how he turned off the lamp as soon as he lay down. His back to me. Like it was routine. Maybe it was. In the mornings, I began walking through the garden. It wasn't much, just a modest plot behind the house, with overgrown bushes and half-dead hydrangeas. But it was mine. The one part of the house that hadn't yet been tamed by someone else's hands. I spent hours pulling weeds, trimming branches, rediscovering color under layers of neglect. It was during one of those quiet mornings that I found it. A folded piece of paper wedged between two wooden slats on the back fence. At first, I thought it was trash. Then I saw the handwriting. Not mine. Not my husband's. Just one sentence, asterisk, I wish someone would hear me. Asterisk. The ink had bled slightly from moisture, but it hadn't been there long. I looked around, half expecting to see someone peeking through the hedges. No one. I stood still for a long time, holding the note in both hands. Then I brought it inside. I didn't mention it to my husband. I tucked it into a book on the coffee table and tried to forget about it. But the next morning, I found another. This time tucked under a flat rock by the garden bench. Asterisk, sometimes silence is louder than screaming. Asterisk. I didn't know what I was doing, but I wrote something back. Folded the paper tight and slipped it where I'd found the second note. I know, I wrote. Asterisk, I felt it too. Asterisk. No signature. No name. It was a whisper between two strangers. Or so I convinced myself. That evening, during dinner, I glanced at the boy. He looked tired. Or thoughtful. I couldn't tell. He barely ate. My husband had a business call and excused himself halfway through the meal. We sat in silence for what felt like hours. Finally, he stood and picked up the dishes. I said thank you. He nodded. That was all. The next morning, there was a reply under the bench, asterisk, then maybe you're not a stranger. Asterisk. It should have frightened me. But it didn't. It felt like a lifeline. Like someone had noticed me in a house where even my footsteps were too soft to echo. Over the following days, the messages continued. Sometimes long, sometimes just a few words. But always meaningful. Always as if they were drawn from the same ache I couldn't name. I started wearing dresses I hadn't touched in years. I told myself it was the weather. I began brushing my hair more carefully, watching how the sunlight caught the strands in the mirror. I felt vain. And alive. There was no confrontation. No secrets spoken aloud. My husband remained preoccupied with deadlines and spreadsheets. His world was always elsewhere, in his phone, in his car, in the office. But in the garden, there was something blooming that had nothing to do with plants. Something quiet and dangerous. One afternoon, I sat on the bench for longer than usual. I kept waiting for a sound, a movement, anything. And then he appeared, the boy, walking toward the fence like he didn't know I was there. But he did. I could tell. He paused when he saw me, then nodded, half smiling. It was the first time I saw him smile. There was something shy about it. Something real. He sat across the yard, picking up a small stone and rolling it between his fingers. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. That night, I reread every message. Laid them out like puzzle pieces across the kitchen table while my husband snored in the next room. The boy's words, whoever he was when he wrote them, were full of yearning, of questions without answers. And my own replies? They scared me. Not because they were lies. But because they weren't. I was telling the truth, for the first time in years. To someone I shouldn't be speaking to. In a way I couldn't explain. I told myself it was just paper. Just ink. Just air between us. But something told me that whatever this was, it had already started long before the first note. The next morning, I walked into the kitchen to find my husband reading the newspaper like nothing had changed. The scent of his cologne still lingered from when he had gotten ready for work, and the smell made my stomach turn, not because it was unpleasant, but because it reminded me of a version of our life that I kept pretending still existed. He offered a polite good morning, barely glancing up. I responded with the same tone, as if we were polite guests in each other's lives now. He sipped his coffee and scrolled through his phone. I stood at the counter, mechanically cutting fruit I didn't even want. When he left, I didn't clean up. I went straight to the garden. There was dew on the grass, soft and cold under my slippers. I walked slowly, pretending to admire the leaves, but my eyes searched instinctively for it, the note. It wasn't under the bench this time. It was wedged carefully into the bark of the old tree, half concealed behind the trunk. I hesitated before reaching for it. For some reason, it felt heavier than usual in my hand. I unfolded it with care. Asterisk, we're both pretending. And we both know it. Asterisk. I read it 3 times before folding it again and placing it in the pocket of my cardigan. I didn't write back right away. Instead, I went inside and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall. The words repeated in my mind, louder than they should have. Later that day, I found myself rearranging the living room furniture. Not because it needed rearranging, but because I couldn't sit still. I moved a chair 3 inches to the left. Shifted a lamp. Dusted a shelf that had no dust. When I finally stopped, I stood in the center of the room, completely out of breath. That evening, I made dinner early, something warm and elaborate. I set the table as if it were a special occasion. When my husband came home, he looked surprised but said nothing. He sat down, ate quietly, and complimented the seasoning. We ate in silence. At one point, I glanced across the table and caught the boy's eyes. There was a flicker of something. Not longing. Not guilt. Something quieter. Recognition, maybe. As if we had both agreed to play roles that no longer fit. After dinner, I collected the plates and moved to the sink. My hands trembled slightly as I scrubbed. I wasn't sure if it was from exhaustion or adrenaline. Maybe both. Behind me, I heard his voice. Need help? I didn't turn around. I just nodded. He came to stand beside me, close but not touching. We worked side by side, passing dishes silently. His shoulder brushed against mine once, accidentally. Or maybe not. I didn't react. But I felt it everywhere. When we finished, I turned off the faucet and wiped my hands slowly. He stood there for a moment longer, looking at the floor. Then, without a word, he walked outside. I waited until I saw his silhouette disappear around the corner toward the garden before I followed. Not immediately, just enough time to pretend I wasn't following at all. The night air was thick with humidity. The garden was dark except for the dim path light near the bench. I saw him standing near the tree where the last note had been. He wasn't moving. Just standing. I approached quietly. He didn't turn, but I knew he heard me. We stood there in silence, both of us facing forward. No one said anything. Then I whispered, more to the night than to him, "You shouldn't have written that." He turned. I saw the shadow of his expression, unreadable in the dark. It was true. I felt my breath catch. The air was heavier now, the silence more alive. "I don't want to lie anymore," he added. I shook my head slowly. "It's not that simple." He looked at me with something close to frustration, but not quite. "Then what is it?" I couldn't answer. I had no words that wouldn't break something. He stepped closer. Not fast, not threatening, just intentional. There was no drama in it. Only quiet certainty. And then, we kissed. It was brief. Gentle. Not desperate. Not wild. Just 2 people pressing pause on everything around them for one stolen moment. When it ended, we didn't speak. We didn't touch again. We just stood there, frozen in the truth of what we had just done. He walked away first. Back toward the house. I remained. I sat on the bench, heart pounding in a steady, unfamiliar rhythm. The kiss hadn't been planned. It hadn't even been imagined. But now it existed, and it changed everything. The garden felt different. Like it had shifted with us. I traced my fingers over the wooden slats of the bench, feeling the coolness of the evening settle into my skin. Eventually, I stood and went back inside. The house was quiet. My husband was in his office, talking on the phone. I passed the door and heard nothing out of the ordinary in his tone. I went upstairs and changed into my nightgown. Brushed my teeth. Washed my face. When I lay down in bed, I stared at the ceiling for a long time. The fan spun above me, rhythmically slicing the air. Beside me, my husband slipped into bed, scrolling on his phone. He didn't look at me. He didn't say goodnight. I turned to face the wall. My eyes remained open long after the lights went out. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. But something inside me had shifted. Something undeniable. And I didn't know what to do with it. I woke up before the sun. The room was still dark, the air slightly cooler than usual, and the silence pressing against my ears was dense, like cotton stuffed into them. I lay there for a few seconds, hoping the heaviness in my chest would disappear if I kept still. But it didn't. It lingered like a bruise beneath the skin. My husband was still asleep beside me, breathing in shallow rhythms, his arm thrown across his side of the bed like he was protecting something that wasn't there. I turned carefully, not wanting to disturb him, and stared at the ceiling fan again, its blades motionless this time. I needed air. Downstairs, I poured myself a glass of water and stood by the kitchen window. The garden was barely visible, just faint outlines of plants and trees in the fading night. I could still feel the press of his lips. It wasn't about passion. It was about recognition, the kind that rattles something deep inside you because it wasn't supposed to happen. I hadn't written a response. Not yet. My hands had hovered over the notepad the night before, pen poised, thoughts swirling, but in the end, I'd left the page blank. Sometimes silence said more. But I also knew silence could be interpreted in 1,000 different ways. Around 7, I started cleaning. Not the casual kind, the desperate kind. I wiped already clean counters, scrubbed the grout in the hallway tile, rearranged the books on the shelves until my fingertips were raw. I even pulled out the vacuum, even though no one had stepped foot in the guest room for weeks. It wasn't about cleanliness. It was about control. By mid-morning, my husband left for a meeting. He kissed me on the cheek again, the same mechanical gesture, like a reflex with no feeling behind it. I stood in the doorway after he left, watching the dust swirl in the sunlight streaming through the window. I waited until I saw the boy come out from his side of the house. He moved slowly across the backyard, head down, holding something in his hand. A book, maybe. I didn't call out. I didn't even wave. I just watched him from behind the curtains, heart thudding for no good reason. After he disappeared behind the trees, I went outside. The air was crisp, and the sunlight was already starting to burn through the morning fog. I walked the familiar path to the bench, pausing beside the tree where we had kissed. The bark looked the same. Nothing in the garden had changed. But I had. There was a note wedged behind a loose board in the fence. I hesitated before pulling it out. Asterisk, I'm sorry. Asterisk. Just 2 words. I folded it slowly, carefully, and tucked it into the front pocket of my sweater. Then I sat on the bench and stared straight ahead, not seeing anything, just letting the breeze move through my hair. What was I supposed to say? That I was sorry too? That I regretted nothing and everything all at once? Later that day, I walked into town. I needed to feel anonymous for a little while. I stopped at the bookstore and bought a novel I didn't plan to read. I wandered into a coffee shop and ordered something sweet, even though I rarely drank anything with sugar. I sat at a window seat and watched people pass by. Mothers with strollers. An older couple holding hands. A man on a bicycle with flowers in his basket. It all looked so normal. So unbroken. I returned home just after noon. The house was quiet. The boy wasn't around. My husband hadn't returned yet. I stood in the hallway, unsure what to do with myself. For the first time in weeks, I didn't want to go to the garden. I went upstairs instead and opened the closet, looking at the rows of dresses I hadn't worn in years. I ran my hand along the fabrics, stopping at one I used to love, soft blue cotton with a delicate belt at the waist. I pulled it out and held it against me, staring at my reflection in the mirror. Time had changed me. Not in the obvious ways, the lines around the eyes, the slight sag of skin. It had changed how I saw myself. I was no longer a wife seeking validation or a woman afraid of loneliness. I was something in between now. Someone in transition. That evening, dinner was quiet again. My husband talked about logistics, some upcoming trip, numbers I didn't care to remember. The boy remained silent, barely touching his food. I didn't speak much either. Words felt like thin ice. After we cleared the table, my husband retreated to his office. I stayed in the kitchen, wiping the same counter 3 times. The boy passed by without speaking, heading toward the back door. And then he stopped. He turned his head slightly, just enough to meet my eyes. There was something in that glance, not expectation, not guilt. Just a quiet acknowledgement. He opened the door and stepped into the dark. I didn't follow. Not that night. Instead, I went upstairs and opened a blank notebook. I stared at the page for a long time before I began to write. Not a note to him. Not a confession. Just the truth. I don't know what I want. But I know what I feel. I know that something in me came alive when you looked at me without judgment. I know that I've been invisible in my own home. I know that pretending only makes it worse. I know that what happened between us wasn't planned. And I know I can't ignore it, I closed the notebook and placed it in the drawer of my nightstand. Then I turned off the lamp and lay in the darkness, eyes open, heart steady. This wasn't a story with easy answers. There would be no neat resolution, no romantic gesture to fix what was broken. But I could no longer pretend that nothing had happened. And maybe that was the first step toward whatever came next. The following days passed in a rhythm that felt forced. Everything I did was calculated, not in a strategic way, but in a survival kind of way. Wake up, brush hair, speak softly. Move through the day as if I were being watched, even when I wasn't. The house itself had started to feel too quiet, like it was waiting for something to happen. Or maybe for something to collapse. I spent less time in the garden. I told myself it was the heat, the bugs, the early signs of seasonal change. But deep down, I knew it was because the garden had turned from a sanctuary into a loaded space. Every leaf, every path, every bench held too much memory now. I avoided it the way people avoid mirrors when they no longer recognize what they see. Still, I found myself drifting toward the edge of it in the late afternoon, as if muscle memory was stronger than fear. I didn't look for notes anymore. I didn't expect one. After that last simple "I'm sorry," there had been silence, and that felt appropriate. The damage had been done. The words had been said. The lines crossed. And still, I couldn't unfeel any of it. My husband had started coming home earlier than usual. He'd walk through the door with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, asking about dinner or errands. I played along, putting on the familiar costume of wife, nodding at the right places, laughing lightly when necessary. I could feel him watching me sometimes, his eyes lingering just a second too long, but he never asked direct questions. Maybe he didn't want answers. One evening, as we sat in the living room watching a program neither of us cared about, he placed his hand on mine. It was a simple gesture, gentle and wordless. I didn't pull away. But I didn't feel warmth from it either. Just obligation. I turned slightly toward him and smiled, trying to meet him halfway. Trying to remember what connection once felt like. The boy wasn't around much that week. I heard his footsteps at odd hours, the door to his room creaking open and closed, but we didn't cross paths. That absence weighed more than his presence ever did. I wasn't sure if I missed him or the version of myself that only existed when he looked at me. On Friday morning, while dusting the hallway bookshelf, I found a small, folded piece of paper tucked behind a row of old novels. It hadn't been left for me. It had been forgotten, or hidden, long ago. But something in me stilled as I reached for it and opened the fragile page. Sometimes I wish I could disappear without hurting anyone. I didn't recognize the handwriting. It might have belonged to a previous occupant or to the boy years ago. But the sentence hit me with unexpected force. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet and honest, and it echoed something I hadn't dared say out loud. I folded it again and placed it back where I'd found it. There was no need to keep it. Just knowing those words existed, that someone, once, had thought them and written them down, was enough. Later that afternoon, I was folding laundry when the doorbell rang. My husband was upstairs on a call, so I answered. It was my neighbor from 2 houses down, a woman with a soft voice and careful smile. She held out a plastic container with pie inside. Saw you in the garden a few times. Thought you might enjoy this, she said. I thanked her and accepted the dish. We exchanged a few polite sentences before she left, and I stood on the porch a moment longer, watching her walk away. Even that brief interaction made me feel exposed, like my every movement had been visible and interpreted. That evening, after dinner, I asked my husband if we could sit outside for a bit. He looked surprised but agreed, carrying his drink with him as we stepped into the backyard. The sun had just dipped behind the trees, and the sky was streaked with soft pink and gold. We sat in silence for a while. The air was still. I miss how we used to be, he said finally, not looking at me. I swallowed hard. I wasn't expecting it. I know, I replied. He nodded slowly, then added, I'm trying. I just don't know what's changed. I didn't respond right away. Because if I did, I'd either have to lie or shatter something. I think maybe we both stopped noticing each other, I said eventually. Not on purpose. Just over time. He turned toward me. Do you still want this? His voice wasn't angry or accusing. Just tired. I looked at him for a long moment, at the man I had once chosen, the man who had offered me a new chapter. I don't know, I answered honestly. He didn't speak after that. He finished his drink and went inside. I remained in the garden, alone in the dim light, listening to the soft hum of insects and the occasional creak of wood settling. My chest felt hollow, but not from guilt. From the weight of truths that had no easy place to land. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't sleep. I kept turning from side to side, blankets tangled around my legs. I got up and walked to the window, looking down at the yard. It looked peaceful from up here. Untouched. But I knew better. In the morning, I wrote a short note. Not to anyone. Not for anyone to read. I wrote it for myself. You cannot unlive a moment. You can only decide what you do with the next one. I folded it, slid it into the bottom of my jewelry box, and closed the lid. I had no idea what I was going to do. But I knew I couldn't keep doing nothing. And maybe that was the beginning of a different kind of truth. There was a heaviness in the air that morning, the kind that settled on your shoulders before you even left the bed. I lay there, eyes open, the sheets pulled up to my chest, waiting for some signal that it was time to move. My husband had already left for the gym, a routine he'd recently picked up, as if a renewed body could patch the quiet unraveling between us. The silence in the house was different now. It wasn't peaceful or empty, it was expectant. Like something was waiting to be said, something that hovered just beyond language. I moved through the motions of the morning, coffee, toast, dishes, as though they were checkpoints in a day I hadn't agreed to live. When I stepped into the garden, I noticed immediately that something had changed. The bench had been shifted slightly, not in a clumsy or accidental way, but as though someone had sat on it with intention. The soil beneath it was pressed with the faint imprints of sneakers. I paused, scanning the usual places, and found it. Folded neatly and tucked under the corner of the bench cushion. My heart quickened before I even opened it, my hands moving before I could second guess. Asterisk, I shouldn't have done it. But I can't pretend it didn't happen. I still see it every time I look at you. Asterisk. I stared at the words until they lost shape, until the letters became meaningless lines. Then I folded it and placed it in the pocket of my cardigan, where it stayed the rest of the day like a stone. The boy didn't appear again until late afternoon. I saw him through the window, standing at the edge of the yard, his posture tense, arms crossed, as if he was trying to hold something inside. I didn't go to him. I watched from behind the curtain until he eventually walked away. That evening, I made dinner as usual. My husband complimented the meal without tasting it properly, his attention split between his plate and his phone. The boy joined us halfway through, his eyes briefly meeting mine before settling on the edge of the table. Conversation was minimal. Mostly logistical things. Who would pick up dry cleaning? What time the plumber was coming? The kind of practical exchanges that barely counted as dialogue. After dinner, I stayed in the kitchen longer than necessary, wiping down the same spot on the counter until the cloth started to fray. I didn't hear him come in behind me. I only noticed when I turned and saw him standing there, holding a plate. Neither of us spoke. He placed the plate in the sink and stood with his hands braced against the counter. I waited for him to say something, anything, but the silence stretched between us like a held breath. Eventually, I walked past him and out the door, not into the yard but toward the garage. I needed a break from spaces that held too much of us. I needed to be somewhere neutral. The garage was cool and dim, cluttered with forgotten boxes and tools. I sat on an old stool near the workbench and let myself breathe. For the first time in days, I allowed my shoulders to drop. My hands rested in my lap, open, as if even my body was done resisting. I didn't hear him approach. But when the door creaked open, I didn't move. He stepped inside and closed it quietly behind him. I don't want to leave, he said, his voice low. I didn't answer. I didn't know what I wanted to say. He stepped closer. I know this is wrong. I know it can't be anything. But it meant something to me. I closed my eyes. The words pierced more than I expected. Not because of what he said, but because of how much I wanted to believe them. I turned to face him, and there it was, the same pull, the same electricity in the air that I had tried to smother. We stood in the dim light, a breath apart. And then, we kissed. It was neither planned nor resisted. It happened the way some storms arrive, all at once and without apology. When it ended, we didn't speak. There was no need to name what had happened. He stepped back. I stepped away. And without another word, we both exited through separate doors, like actors leaving a stage after the final curtain. That night, I sat at my vanity, brushing my hair with slow, even strokes. My reflection was unreadable. I didn't see guilt or joy. Just fatigue. My husband came in later than usual, mumbling something about work emails and an early morning. He didn't notice the tension in the room. Or maybe he did and chose to ignore it. That was his way. When he climbed into bed, I pretended to be asleep. I faced the wall and breathed evenly, counting the seconds between each inhale and exhale. He turned off the lamp and the room fell into darkness. I lay there for hours, eyes open, listening to the hum of the ceiling fan and the faint creaks of the house settling. I tried to replay the day, to find a moment where I could have chosen differently, stepped away, said no. But I couldn't. Because the truth was, in that moment, I hadn't wanted to stop. I didn't feel proud of that. I didn't feel victorious. I felt cracked. Like a teacup glued back together, still whole, but forever changed. In the morning, I woke up before the sun again. I went to the garden in my robe and slippers, holding a thermos of coffee that had already gone cold. The air was damp, and the grass wet against my feet. I sat on the bench and stared at the horizon. No words this time. No notes. Just me and the silence. I didn't know what would come next. But I knew the version of me that had arrived at this house weeks ago was gone. And whoever I was becoming, she didn't want to pretend anymore. I stayed away from the garden for 2 full days. It wasn't a conscious decision at first, just small avoidances that became habits. I would open the kitchen door, step out for air, then pause before crossing the threshold of the grass, choosing instead to circle back inside. I told myself it was because the sun was too harsh, or because I had things to do, but deep down I knew the truth. I was afraid of what the garden now meant. Afraid of what I had made it into. I spent more time in the laundry room, folding towels that didn't need folding, sorting drawers that were already organized. I busied myself with tasks that made me feel like a version of who I had been before. The woman who believed in new starts, in effort, in reinvention. But even as I moved through those motions, I felt like I was drifting further from that version of myself. My husband had started to notice. He would pause longer in the doorway when I was washing dishes, or ask if everything was okay with a tone that carried more weight than the words themselves. I responded with the usual reassurances, smiles too quick, gestures too practiced. I think he believed me, but only because he needed to. On the 3rd night, there was a thunderstorm. Not a dramatic one, just a slow, steady rhythm of rain tapping against the windows, accompanied by occasional rumbles in the distance. The kind of storm that softened the world, made it feel suspended in time. We had dinner in near silence, the clinking of silverware the only real sound between us. Afterward, my husband disappeared into his office to take a call. I stood at the kitchen sink, watching the water stream down the windowpane, the garden barely visible through the haze. My reflection stared back at me in the glass, tired, unfamiliar. I reached out and touched the surface, half expecting it to ripple. That's when I saw movement. At first, I thought it was a trick of the rain. But then I saw him, standing just past the tree line, barely visible in the dim light. He wasn't moving. Just standing, arms at his sides, as if waiting for something. For me. I didn't think. I grabbed a shawl from the hook near the door and stepped outside, the rain cool against my skin. It wasn't a heavy downpour, just enough to dampen the air and soak into the edges of your clothes. My slippers were wet in seconds, but I didn't care. He didn't speak when I reached him. Neither did I. We stood under the trees, the scent of wet earth rising around us. I could feel his breath, shallow and steady. I could see the outline of his face in the half-light. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. Because what was there to say? That I regretted it? That I didn't? That every part of me was tangled between right and wrong, between desire and consequence? Instead, I reached into my pocket and handed him a note. It wasn't long. Just a sentence I had written that morning, unsure if I would ever deliver it. Asterisk, we can't undo it, but we can decide what it means. Asterisk. He took it, read it slowly, and nodded. Then he stepped back, just slightly, and turned to leave. I watched him go, the rain softening his silhouette until he disappeared behind the shed. I stayed outside a while longer, letting the rain soak through my shawl, my hair, my skin. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I just stood there, absorbing the quiet, absorbing myself. When I finally went inside, I changed into dry clothes and made tea. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the steam rising from the cup, the sound of my husband's voice still drifting down the hallway from his office. I wondered if he knew, not in detail, but in essence. If he sensed something had fractured and we were both pretending it hadn't. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, the sheets twisting around my legs, my mind refusing to quiet. I got up and went downstairs, walking barefoot across the cool tile. I didn't turn on the lights. I just moved through the darkness by memory. In the living room, I found the small notebook I had started weeks ago, the one I kept hidden behind the bookshelf. I sat down and opened it, flipping through the pages filled with half-thoughts and unspoken confessions. Then I turned to a blank page and began to write. Asterisk, he doesn't ask, and I don't tell. But the silence between us grows louder each day. I am losing pieces of myself in this pretending, and I don't know how many more I can afford to lose. The garden used to feel like freedom. Now it feels like guilt buried in dirt. Asterisk. I closed the notebook and tucked it back into its hiding place. When I turned to go upstairs, I saw something out of the corner of my eye, a small shape on the coffee table. It was a folded napkin, the kind we kept in the kitchen. I hadn't put it there. I picked it up, heart already racing. Unfolded it carefully. Asterisk, sometimes you don't choose the connection. It chooses you. Asterisk. There was no name, no handwriting I didn't already recognize. Just those 9 words. I folded it again and held it in my hand for a long time before sliding it into the pocket of my robe. I didn't go back to bed. I sat in the dark, listening to the storm fade into silence, wondering how something that felt so quiet could take up so much space inside me. In the morning, my husband asked if I'd been up late. I said yes. He nodded, poured himself coffee, and didn't press further. The boy didn't appear at breakfast. I assumed he had gone out early. The house felt lighter without him in it, and that, too, came with its own weight. I spent the rest of the day in motion. Cleaning the fridge. Organizing old mail. Rearranging the pantry. But no matter how much I moved, the feeling didn't leave. That evening, as the sky began to dim, I stood at the edge of the garden again. The grass had dried. The trees swayed gently in the breeze. Everything looked ordinary. But nothing was ordinary anymore. And I knew the silence between all of us would only grow heavier. Until someone, inevitably, broke it. The air was thick with humidity that morning, the kind that made everything feel slower, heavier. I opened the window in the kitchen, hoping for a breeze, but the air outside was just as still as the one trapped inside. It was a Sunday, a day that used to mean something in our house. Pancakes, coffee, the sound of music humming low from the speaker in the corner. But today, like so many others, passed without acknowledgement. My husband was already gone, having left a note on the counter that he'd be at the hardware store and then stopping by his brother's. He didn't ask if I wanted to join. I didn't offer. There were no expectations anymore, just a quiet coordination of tasks and movements, like roommates in a house that had forgotten how to be a home. I stood by the window longer than necessary, sipping coffee that had already cooled. My eyes kept drifting toward the garden, to the space near the fence, to the path that curved just out of sight. There were no notes today. I hadn't looked. I told myself I wouldn't. But by early afternoon, I found myself out there anyway, barefoot on the stone path, the sun pressing down on the back of my neck. I walked slowly, letting my fingers brush the tops of the flowers that were starting to wilt from the heat. The bench was empty. No notes. No signs. I sat anyway. The silence around me wasn't peaceful, it was too aware, like it had learned to listen. I closed my eyes and leaned back, letting the sun warm my face, letting my thoughts do what they wanted for once instead of pushing them aside. It had been a week since that night. The night that had changed the rhythm of everything. I could still feel the echo of it in my chest, a pulse that hadn't quieted. It wasn't just the act itself. It was the understanding that came with it, that no matter how carefully we tiptoed around the truth, it was already embedded in the spaces between us. I hadn't spoken to him since then. We had passed each other in the hallways of the house like shadows, never quite meeting eyes, never quite absent either. Every time I heard his door open, I felt the air shift. Every time I heard his steps, I held my breath without meaning to. Later that evening, I decided to make dinner. Not out of obligation, but because I needed something to do with my hands. I peeled vegetables, seared meat, boiled rice. The familiar motions gave me something to anchor myself to. He appeared in the kitchen while I was setting the table. Not a word. Just the soft sound of his footsteps and the clink of a glass being filled at the sink. We sat in silence, eating as if nothing sat between us. My husband joined us halfway through, bringing a burst of casual energy that felt too loud for the quiet tension. He talked about someone he saw in town, about a possible business opportunity. I nodded when I needed to. I don't think either of them noticed how quiet I had become. After dinner, my husband excused himself, heading upstairs to take a call. The boy remained at the table, slowly swirling the ice in his glass. I stood to collect the plates, and as I did, his hand brushed mine. Just for a second. Just long enough to remind me that we were still tethered to something invisible. He didn't look up. Neither did I. Later, long after the house had gone still, I walked downstairs again. I didn't turn on the lights. The moon was enough to see by, casting soft shadows across the floor. I went to the living room and stood by the window, looking out at the garden, where everything had started and where everything had somehow broken open. I thought about the woman I had been before the first note, before the first glance that lingered too long. She had been lonely, yes. But she had also been certain. Now I wasn't lonely. I was something more complicated than that. The front door creaked softly, and I turned just enough to see him step inside. He looked surprised to find me there, but he didn't retreat. He closed the door gently behind him and stepped closer, slow and uncertain. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. For a moment, we just stood there, the space between us charged but still. And then, like a quiet decision made without words, we spent the night together. There's nothing else to say about that. Not because there isn't more, but because some moments resist description. Some truths can't be folded into sentences. In the morning, I woke before the sun, the light just beginning to stretch its fingers across the edge of the sky. I slipped out of the room without a sound, careful not to disturb the silence that still held us. In the kitchen, I boiled water for tea, standing barefoot on the cold tile, waiting for the kettle to whistle. My hands trembled slightly as I poured the water, not from fear, but from the weight of what I now carried. When my husband came down later, he didn't notice anything unusual. He asked if I had slept well. I said I had. He kissed my temple, lightly, distantly, and walked outside to check the garden hose. I sat at the table, staring into my tea, and wondered what would happen next. Because something had shifted. And there was no turning it back. The morning after, everything felt normal, too normal. The birds outside chirped in their predictable rhythm, the faucet in the kitchen still leaked slightly when turned too far, and my husband hummed to himself as he shuffled through the newspaper. It was all so ordinary that it became unbearable. The weight of what had happened pressed against my chest in sharp contrast to the soft, domestic morning sounds. I moved through the kitchen slowly, setting the table, pouring juice, answering brief questions with half-smiles. I watched my husband's eyes scan the headlines while he sipped his coffee, and I wondered what he would see if he turned that gaze toward me. Could he read the lines of guilt on my face? Would he notice the small tremors in my hands? He didn't. He told me he'd be out most of the afternoon, errands, meetings, maybe lunch with his sister if she was in town. He kissed my cheek on his way out, just like he always did. The gesture made me flinch on the inside, but I didn't move. When the door closed behind him, I stood in the hallway for a long time, staring at the space he had just occupied. My reflection in the glass of the front door looked tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep could fix, but the kind that came from carrying too many contradictions at once. The boy wasn't downstairs. His door was closed. I assumed he had heard the front door, knew my husband had left. The silence between our rooms was louder now. It pulsed with memory and anticipation. But I didn't seek him out. Not today. Instead, I walked out to the garden and sat on the bench, the sun already warming the stone beneath my legs. I expected to find something, a note, a sign, but there was nothing. Just the rustle of leaves in the breeze and the distant bark of a neighbor's dog. It was better this way. Simpler. At least in theory. I stayed in the garden for over an hour, trying to let the stillness root me, to remind myself that life could exist in quiet, in pause. But my thoughts refused to settle. They circled endlessly around what had happened. Not just the night itself, but everything that led to it. The glances. The silence. The aching hunger for something I couldn't even define. When I finally went back inside, the house felt different. As if it had absorbed the truth I was trying to hide. I spent the afternoon cleaning. Not to fix anything, but because I didn't know what else to do. I stripped the bedsheets, scrubbed the baseboards, rearranged the pantry. My hands stayed busy while my mind churned. Later, as I was wiping the kitchen counters for the third time, I heard the stairs creak. His footsteps were light, hesitant. I didn't turn. I kept wiping the same clean space. He walked past me, stopping briefly at the fridge to pour himself a glass of water. He lingered, as if he might say something, but didn't. Then he turned and left the room. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The rest of the day passed in fragments. A knock at the door from the mailman. A message from my sister that I didn't answer. The distant sound of a lawnmower 2 houses over. I moved through it all like I was underwater, slow, detached, waiting. By evening, my husband returned. He brought groceries, talked about traffic, asked if I wanted to watch something later. I nodded. Said sure. I went through the motions with the same precision I always had, but everything inside me felt out of sync. While he unpacked the bags, I excused myself to the bathroom. I locked the door and sat on the closed toilet lid, staring at the floor tiles. I counted the small blue diamonds in the pattern until my vision blurred. It wasn't just the guilt that consumed me. It was the weight of knowing I had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. I had stepped into a version of myself I didn't fully understand, and now I had to carry her with me. When I returned to the kitchen, dinner was already being prepared. My husband handed me a cutting board and knife, and we worked side by side in relative silence. Occasionally, he would comment on a recipe or the smell of something roasting, and I would nod, contribute just enough to keep things from feeling strange. The boy didn't join us for dinner. His absence sat at the table with us like a ghost. After we ate, I washed the dishes while my husband went to his office. The television in the other room buzzed faintly in the background, some game show or rerun, I couldn't tell. I moved mechanically, drying the last plate and placing it in the cabinet with practiced ease. Then I went upstairs. I passed his door on the way to mine. It was closed, the light underneath dim. I paused for only a moment before continuing. In my bedroom, I sat at the edge of the bed and stared at the mirror. My reflection looked the same, and yet completely foreign. I didn't recognize the woman who had let this happen, who had participated in something so deeply wrong and yet so achingly human. I reached into the drawer of my nightstand and pulled out the notebook again. I flipped to a blank page and wrote slowly, deliberately. Asterisk, there's a difference between wanting and needing. I wanted to be seen. I needed to feel real. And for a brief moment, I did. But now, all I feel is the weight of silence. The kind that grows in every room and waits at every doorway. Asterisk. I closed the notebook and set it aside. Then I lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling fan as it turned above me, its blades humming a rhythm that matched the heaviness in my chest. The house felt too big that night. Too full of memories. Too empty of clarity. And as I drifted into sleep, one thought echoed louder than the rest. What happens next isn't a question of feeling. It's a question of consequence. Time began to pass in smaller pieces, not days or hours, but glances, silences, footsteps down the hallway. I no longer marked the morning by the sound of the coffee machine or the rustle of the newspaper, but by who avoided whom and how often. The house became a system of quiet maneuvering, each of us taking turns pretending we didn't notice what the other was not saying. I didn't return to the garden that week. Something about it felt over, not physically, but symbolically. It had served its purpose. It had offered sanctuary, then tension, and then, eventually, it had become evidence. Evidence of a version of myself I now struggled to recognize. He and I didn't speak. Not a word. Not even in passing. But his presence, even muted, weighed more than his absence ever had. I became acutely aware of every sound he made, the creak of his bedroom floorboards, the quiet closing of a cabinet door. It was like my body had been trained to recognize him even in silence. Especially in silence. My husband was beginning to notice the shift. He had started watching me with longer stares, ones he didn't always disguise. He asked more questions, not direct, not invasive, but questions that lingered a bit too long. Everything okay, he would ask as I stirred a pot, or you've been quiet lately, when I sat across from him in the evenings. I always smiled and said yes. It was easier that way. Then came Saturday. A morning like any other, sunlight creeping through the blinds, the distant hum of someone mowing their lawn. My husband had stepped out for groceries, something he rarely did, insisting he wanted to help more. I didn't argue. I was upstairs, changing sheets in the guest room, when I heard a knock on the front door. It wasn't hurried or heavy, just a simple knock knock knock. I wiped my hands on a towel and descended the stairs, not expecting anyone. As I opened the door, a small envelope fell from the handle and landed at my feet. No one was there. I bent down and picked it up. No name, no handwriting. Just a plain white envelope, sealed. I closed the door slowly and stood in the hallway, staring at the envelope in my hand. I wanted to throw it away. I wanted to pretend I never saw it. But instead, I carried it to the kitchen, sat down at the table, and opened it. Inside was a single note, written in small, careful print. Asterisk, you are my only truth. Asterisk. My breath caught. I set the note on the table and stared at it. The words didn't shock me, they only confirmed what I had refused to say aloud. Still, seeing them written like that, with finality, made everything feel sharper. I folded the note and slid it into the drawer next to the silverware, hiding it beneath a stack of old receipts. Then I got up and started cleaning again, the default motion for when I didn't know what else to do. When my husband returned, I greeted him with a smile. He handed me a bouquet of sunflowers and said they reminded him of the ones we'd seen years ago on a trip. I thanked him, placed them in water, and didn't mention the note. The rest of the day unfolded like a routine we'd rehearsed too many times. Lunch. Chores. A walk around the block. I laughed at his jokes when I could. I held his hand when it felt expected. That evening, I stood at the sink after dinner, scrubbing dishes I had already rinsed. I could feel his presence behind me before he spoke. "You've been somewhere else lately," he said. I turned to face him, plate still in my hand. "What do you mean?" "You're here, but not here." He studied my face. "Are you unhappy?" I shook my head too quickly. "No. I've just been tired." He nodded, but something in his eyes changed, a narrowing, a calculation. He didn't press further. Instead, he kissed my forehead and went upstairs. I stayed in the kitchen long after the lights were off in our bedroom. I took the note from the drawer and held it under the pendant light, reading the words again. Then I burned it over the sink, watching the flame eat through the paper until only ash remained. It didn't make me feel better. The next morning, I woke early and walked outside before anyone else was up. The sky was still pale, the world hushed. I stood at the edge of the garden and looked at the bench, then turned away and sat on the steps instead. Behind me, I heard the door open softly. I didn't need to look to know it was him. He sat beside me without a word. The air was thick with unsaid things, but neither of us reached for them. "I think I need to leave," he said quietly. I didn't ask where or why. I just nodded. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he added after a pause. "I know," I said. "But it did." We sat there a little longer, watching the morning arrive. When he finally stood and went inside, I stayed where I was, the sun warming my arms, my mind empty. Later that day, my husband suggested a weekend trip. "Just the two of us," he said, smiling. "We could use the break." I agreed. Because the truth was, I needed distance, from the house, from the memories, from myself. That night, I lay awake in bed, listening to the soft hum of the ceiling fan and the occasional shifting of sheets as my husband turned in his sleep. I thought about the envelope. The bench. The silence. The fact that truth could be so quiet and still destroy everything in its path. And I knew that whatever came next, it wouldn't be about choosing between two people. It would be about choosing who I was going to be from this moment on. Time didn't stop when he left. It didn't pause for clarity or give me space to prepare for the hollow that followed. It moved on in its steady, indifferent way. The sun still rose each morning, the mail still arrived, the dishes still needed washing. But something in the air had shifted. The silence in the house was no longer tense, it was final. He didn't say goodbye the morning he left. I heard the front door close softly, almost respectfully, and when I stepped into the hallway, he was already gone. His room was bare, the sheets folded neatly at the foot of the bed, the window left slightly open. A faint breeze stirred the curtains, and I stood there, not quite breathing, for several minutes. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I simply turned away and closed the door behind me. My husband noticed the absence, of course. That evening, he walked into the kitchen while I was chopping vegetables and said, "He's gone?" "Yes," I replied, without turning. He leaned against the counter for a while. I could feel his eyes on me, but I didn't look up. "You didn't tell me he was planning to leave." I paused with the knife still in my hand. He made the decision quickly. He didn't push further. He just nodded, slowly, like he was agreeing with something unspoken. Then he left the room, and I returned to chopping, even though I no longer remembered what I was making. In the following days, I moved through the house like I was living inside a memory. Everything reminded me of something. The bench in the garden, the books on the shelf, the sound of the stairs creaking at night. Even my own reflection felt like a photograph, frozen, two-dimensional, staring back with too much knowledge in her eyes. I started spending more time outside the house. Walking aimlessly through shops, sitting in the park with a coffee I rarely drank. I watched strangers go about their lives, unaware that they were being observed by a woman who no longer fit neatly into hers. I envied their simplicity, or maybe just their distance from mine. One afternoon, I ran into a neighbor at the market. She asked how I was adjusting to everything, the house, the marriage, the quiet. I smiled and said, I'm settling in. It wasn't a lie. I was settling into something. Just not what she imagined. That night, I opened the drawer where I had kept the old notes. The one where I had burned the last message, the one I thought would be the final piece. But I didn't find silence in that drawer. I found space. A hollow space that echoed something I hadn't faced yet. I pulled out the notebook I hadn't touched in over a week and opened to a blank page. There is a difference between forgetting and leaving something behind. I don't want to forget. I just want to stop carrying it with me everywhere I go. I closed the book without signing it. A few days later, my husband asked if I wanted to visit his sister's lake house. We could use the change of scenery, he said. I nodded. There was no resistance in me anymore. No energy for performance. Just a desire to be somewhere else. The lake was calm, still half frozen in places. The house was simple and quiet, just like everything else in our life had become. We didn't talk much during the drive. We didn't need to. The distance between us had become familiar, almost comforting in its predictability. I sat on the porch the second morning, wrapped in a blanket, watching the fog rise from the water. He joined me with 2 mugs of coffee. We sat in silence for a long time. Eventually, he asked, "Are you happy?" It was a question so simple and so large that I didn't know how to answer. I turned toward him and said, "I'm here." He nodded. I think he understood what I meant. That happiness wasn't the right word anymore. That presence was the best I could offer. When we returned home, the house greeted us like an old friend, unchanged, waiting. The garden had started to bloom again, small green buds pressing through the soil, stubborn in their growth. I walked to the bench later that week and sat there for the first time in what felt like ages. The wood was weathered, the paint beginning to chip. I ran my fingers over it slowly, like reading Braille. There were no new notes, no signs, just the faint hum of spring arriving. I pulled a small envelope from my jacket pocket, blank, folded. Inside was a single piece of paper. I'm not who I was when this began. And maybe that's the point. I placed it beneath the bench, not for anyone else to find, but to leave something behind. Not a confession. Not a secret. Just a marker of change. That night, as I stood in the bathroom brushing my hair, I caught my reflection again. She looked tired. But she also looked real. Less polished, less careful, more honest. I climbed into bed beside my husband. He reached out and took my hand. Not with ownership, not with demand, just presence. And I didn't pull away. For the first time in a long while, I slept through the night. In the morning, I made tea and stepped outside. The garden shimmered with dew, the grass soft beneath my feet. The sun was just beginning to rise, coloring the world in pale gold. I stood still and breathed deeply, letting the air fill spaces in me I hadn't visited in months. I didn't know what came next. But for now, that was enough.